Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. I am Jen Bradovich. I'm our Director of Exhibitions and Programs here at Print Center, New York. I am so excited for tonight's conversation, Printing with Fire, Bethany Collins and Dario Robleto in conversation with Jennifer L. Roberts. This talk is presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Visual Record, The Materiality of Sound in Print. Visual Record is curated by Ellery Erdos, and it's on view at our brand new exhibition space on the ground floor of 535 West 24th Street through January 21st. So if you haven't seen it, you've still got some time. Tonight's program, we've been looking forward to for a long time, and we are very happy to be joined tonight by Jennifer L. Roberts, who's going to lead the conversation. Jennifer is an art historian at Harvard whose work richly brings together interests in print studies, history of science and technology, craft and materiality theory. In 2021, she delivered the 70th annual Mellon Lectures for the National Gallery of Art about printmaking. It was called Contact, Art and Pull of the Print. It's available online, and we will put a link in the chat box so you can check it out if you haven't seen it. This talk also brings into conversation two artists in visual record, Bethany Collins and Dario Robleto, whose works in the show and whose practices overall give us so much to dig into that I know we're only going to scratch the surface of what we could do tonight. We're going to drop bios in the chat box, and Jennifer's also going to give you a fuller introduction to both artists. So I'll just quickly run through some housekeeping and then hand it off to her. Tonight's event has auto-generated captions. To turn those on, hit the CC button at the bottom of your screen, or if you're on mobile, turn them on in the settings menu. The talk is also being recorded. It will be available in about a week or so. For folks at home, please send any questions using the Q&A box. We will save some time to take questions at the end. The public chat is also open. You can contribute to the conversation there with comments, say hello, tell us where you're joining us from, etc. Just be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box so that we don't miss them. Okay, so we can get started. I will ask our speakers to turn their cameras on and join us on screen. Hi, hi, hi. Hi, Bethany. Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Dario. How are you doing? Thank you so much for being here. And with that, Jennifer, I will hand it off to you. And I'm so looking forward to this. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you so much, Jen. And thanks to everyone for tuning in this evening. It's great to see you all, or at least the numerical representation of you in our attendee tally there. I know there are a lot of people in the audience that we would love to see on camera, but this is, alas, a webinar. So please do say hello in the chat if you're so inclined. I just want to start by thanking Judy Hecker and Jen and the entire Print Center staff for your assistance with this program. And I also want to congratulate Ellery Erdos, curator of the Visual Record exhibition, for her remarkable achievement with this show. There have been, of course, plenty of exhibitions out there on print and plenty of exhibitions about sound and its relationship to art, but there haven't been, to my knowledge, very many opportunities to think about the relationship between print and sound. And yet, as this really watershed exhibition demonstrates, print and sound are in fact so thoroughly intertwined that it's hard to pry them apart again once you realize all their connections. And so I want to thank all of the artists in the exhibition for helping us to see this. And I couldn't be more honored to have artists, the artists in the show, Bethany Collins and Dario Robleto, here with me tonight to help us think through these connections in more detail. Thanks to both of you for giving so generously of your time this evening. Now, let me give you a quick outline of how things will go this evening. I'm just going to be making a few basic introductory remarks. Then I'll introduce our artist guests. They'll each speak for about 10 minutes about their work. And then we'll have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A. And we plan to go for about an hour and 15 minutes total. That's including Q&A. So the idea for this program emerged this past summer after I turned in the final draft of my essay for the catalog for this exhibition. I really needed to get on with other things at the time, but I found that these two works Bethany's laser burnt hymnal and Dario's flame-sooted pulse wave portfolio kept spinning up in my mind, circling around each other. They seemed to have more to say to me and to each other than they had room to do in my essay. I kept coming back to them. The two projects seemed to focus each other, and they also hinted at new kinds of insights about sound and print generally, and I found that I just couldn't get them out of my head. I felt compelled to unpack them more fully, and so that's why we're here today. And as I see it, we're just obeying the insistence of the works themselves. The prints made us do it. Can we have the next slide, Jen? Oh, that one, right. So if you've been to the exhibition, you know that these two projects are among the smallest and quietest in the entire room. The space is full of these gorgeous, striking, wall-holding works, but these operate at a more intimate scale. They're intricate, they're subtle, they're unassuming, even whispery, we might say. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this program was to give us a chance to spend a little more time listening carefully to them. Next slide. So both of these projects were completed in 2017 and both use fire as a vehicle for printing historic sounds and songs. Bethany's America, a Hymnal is a 100-page artist book. Each page features the same melody, My Country 'Tis of Thee, but is printed with different lyrics that have been set to the tune over the years. The lyrics are printed in red ink while the notes have been cut away with a laser cutter, leaving singe marks and a precarious architecture of paper behind. Dario's contribution to the exhibition is a set of 6 prints from his 50-print portfolio, The First Time, The Heart. Each of these prints is based on a historic pulse recording that he recovered from an archive. This one, for example, titled Sadness from Listening to a Sung Melody, features pulse recordings taken from an anonymous subject while they were listening to music. The pulse waves and the text are printed in transparent ink and then buried in soot through a process of hand flaming and then dug out again from that soot with a tiny solvent-soaked brush. Now, Bethany and Dario will be saying much more about these works in just a moment, but I just want to frame one initial thought as we go forward about the relationship between these projects. Both Dario and Bethany are interested in the preservation and retrieval of the past through printed sound. Both are deeply interested in the emotional, political, and material complexity of that process, particularly as it relates to the creation or failure of collective memory. The singe and the soot in their work, it seems to me, embodies this complexity because even as it is the very medium of fixing sound on the page, in other words, fire is used to fix these inscriptions, it also marks at the same time the ephemerality and haunting uncertainty of sound. So just one little thing to start thinking about. And now I just want to introduce our two guests. So first, Bethany. I'll introduce both of them and then we'll move on to their presentations. Bethany Collins is a multidisciplinary artist based in Chicago. Her work with sound and print has evolved out of her interest in language, the power as well as the precarity of language. As we'll see, her work often tugs at the seams between sound, symbol, and significance. She's interested in the way even a fixed set of letters can dissolve into contradictory meanings, or the way a single sound can attach itself to multiple different texts. She is focused especially on the way race is constructed and deconstructed along these unstable seams. She's exhibited in solo and group exhibitions nationwide, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, the High Museum of Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art at Georgia, and the Birmingham Museum of Art. She was recently awarded a prestigious 2022 Joan Mitchell Fellowship. And one of the reasons that I'm so grateful for having had the opportunity to work on this exhibition is that it gives me an excuse to dive so much more deeply into Bethany's remarkable work. And for those of you that would like to do the same, I'd recommend you take a look at the beautiful catalog from her exhibition titled A Pattern or Practice, which was just published about a month ago by the University Galleries of Illinois State University. Dario Robleto is an artist, writer, and filmmaker based in Houston, tapping into a huge range of disciplines from astrobiology to DJ culture. His work explores the history and practice of recording as a structure for the relay of meaning, especially emotional meaning. For the past 25 years, he's been a leader among artists exploring the materiality of sound, especially in sculpture. He's well known for melting and casting vinyl records and stretching cassette tape into long hair-like filaments. He's also designed album covers for bands such as the Wild Moccasins and Yo La Tengo. His work is held in prominent collections, including the Hirshhorn Museum, the LA County Museum of Art, the Menil Collection, and the Whitney Museum. He's lectured, taught, and had residencies at a wide range of institutions throughout the country, from the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation to the Space Telescope Science Institute. A retrospective of his work will open on January 26th at the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University. And I just want to acknowledge full disclosure that it's thanks to Dario that I know anything at all about sound. I curated a small exhibition of his work at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute a few years ago, and it was that got me thinking for the first time about really all of the questions that animate this exhibition. I really wouldn't be here if his work hadn't pulled me into this world, so thank you, Dario, for that. All right, before I turn it over to Bethany to do her 10-minute chat, I just want to make a quick note on the technical side, sort of technical preamble, a note on the images. Some of you may see, as the slides are changed, a pixelated or slightly blurry image, but if you just wait a few seconds, it will in fact snap into focus. We found that Zoom is having trouble processing some of the works in this PowerPoint, which I think is because the work is so subtle and intricate that Zoom doesn't quite know what to do with it. So if something looks fuzzy to you, wait a few seconds and it will clarify. All right, thanks so much. And I'm going to pass it along to Bethany.
Thank you, Jennifer. It's nice to be here with you all. And thank you to the Print Center for bringing us all into conversation, and Ellery as well. So I wanted to share three different works that become eventually three different series. They're all language-based, as is my entire practice. Language is the subject and primary material of all of my work. All three of these works that I wanted to walk you through also come after the 2016 presidential election. So they're very disparate works, but they're all in some way a kind of response to that moment. One of the first works that I made after that election was America, a Hymnal. And for as much as I love language, other people's language, writing is the most excruciating act to me. And so this hymnal is as close as I will get to being author. This is my book. And so America Hymnal, we can go to the next slide, consists of 100 different versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee that were written from the 18th to 20th centuries. So the version that we know is written in 1831, Reverend Francis Smith. And I think it's sung for the first time in Boston by a children's choir. But the tune actually precedes that writing and is the tune for 6 other national anthems. And then it continues onward. There are versions that were rewritten in support of various political social causes. Can we go to the next slide? So the idea was this used to be a much more common early American practice. And the term of these songs is called contrafacta. It's when the melody remains consistent, but the lyrics are rewritten, typically for different political ends. And so My Country 'Tis of Thee was rewritten at least 100 times in support of native sovereignty, rebellion, revolution, suffrage, temperance. You can tell what we were nationally obsessed about at any given moment by how many versions were rewritten of the song in support of prohibition in particular. The Confederacy has their versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee, and so do the Union Army, so do abolitionists. And binding all 100 versions together then became a kind of response to, they're inescapably linked forever together. They must abide one another within the body of the hymnal. But the second step of this process was to burn the musical notation away and leave only the differing lyrics legible, so that by the time you've made it through the text, all that you can read, all that's left visible is 100 dissenting versions of what it means to be American. And the most interesting then are when they're in direct opposition to each other. There is no agreement in the text. Can we go to the next slide? but also reading through the text. And these next 3 images are from Molly Schwartzberg, just to send out a thank you for these images and her lovely essay. The hymnal is also bound in the style of a shape note hymnal. This is early American singing system and practice. It begins in the colonies. It's mostly popular in the American South today. So it is bound in horizontal, and the notes are shaped. Shape note singers are fascinating. They also become the basis and part of the idea for a lot of the performances that come out of the hymnal. Next slide. But the last part of the hymnal that I wanted to mention is that the more that you read the text, because the shaped notes and the staff lines, the entire musical notation has been burned away from the book. Usually about 10 pages at a time is what the laser can cut through without setting the whole book on fire. That the more that you turn the pages of the text, the more complicated it becomes. They tangle and they cling together, and they become, in some ways, a disaster, complicated and messy. And that was intentional for that moment as well. It's not just that 100 versions are bound together forever. It's that democracy becomes increasingly messy the more we participate in it. And that becomes a choice on the part of the viewer to continue to read the text and to participate in its complication, or to let it remain as it is and where it began, imperfect as it was. Next slide. I also wanted to mention another series that came after the election. These are the Odyssey series. So these are, I think the Odyssey was assigned in high school. I'm sure it was. I'm sure I skipped it. But Emily Wilson's version of the Odyssey from 2017 made me actually read through the entire text. Emily Wilson is the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English in 2017. And eventually I got to book 13 when Odysseus finally lands on the shoreline of his own country after 10 years at war, 10 years weeping on every wrong shoreline he lands upon. He finally stands on the shoreline of his own country, looks around, and does not recognize the place. The place that he has longed for is utterly foreign to him. And so focusing on book 13 and comparing translations for there, that sense of a place that can feel familiar and simultaneously estranging became a really helpful metaphor for me in thinking about that election moment as well. Familiar and estranging. Can we go to the next slide? So these works are always comparing at least two different translations of the Odyssey by 2 different translators, 2 different decades, sometimes 2 different centuries. And what's interesting about this text to me is that after 400 years of translations into English, some 60 translations, you might expect the text to be settled, to be a kind of settled law by now. And it is not. Some of the first questions that Odysseus asks are translated in drastically different ways. Even the water that he looks out upon, we do not know what the water was doing. There is no agreement in the hymnal. There is no agreement in the translations. The water is tumultuous, it is deep voiced, it is whispering and deaf and hoarse upon the rocks. It is loud and resounding and booming. There is no agreement in the text. So for these works, these are printed translations of the Odyssey and then rewritten in graphite. And then everything is erased using saliva because it eats into the paper, except 2 opposing definitions. I know this is a detailed image, but what was left legible here was who are the men who were born here? I think that was from 1852. And then the translation in 1980 is who are the people that dwell in this place? Those are 2 very different translations about belonging and what does it take to belong to a place. It feels like it reveals not only the translator's hand, but the time in which they lived as well. Next slide. So I wanted to mention one more body of work, one more series. These are also prints. They're twice embossed prints. They are acid-free newsprint. And the text, if we can go to the next slide, they're a collection of classified ads placed by formerly enslaved people following emancipation all the way up until the 1920s. There's a really lovely book about this work or the research into these classified ads by Heather Williams called "Can You Help Me to Find My People?" So in the body of the ad, it might be a little hard to see, but as in all of my work, part of that illegibility is intentional. In the body of the ad, people would list everything that they could remember about their loved ones in the hope of reunification. Names, given names, nicknames, other nicknames that only you might know or somebody else might know. Identifying features, scars, where you lived, the plantation on which you were born or left, the last place they saw you, everything they could remember in the hopes of finding their loved ones. They are love letters, and I made these works following the family separation crisis at the border under the previous administration. And so the way that they fall apart, if we could go to the next slide, that disintegration of the page happens during the second embossing. So I engrave the text of the classified ads, but that's being digitized by Mother Bethel Church in Philadelphia into an acrylic plate backwards, soak the paper, and then run that through the press. Take it up and do the whole thing again. And because it's an acid-free newsprint, it's a more fragile paper than I typically use. It doesn't hold up the second time. Those abrasions to the surface of the page, they show, and the paper holds the history of what has been done to it. What I still like about these works, and I think there's a relationship to the hymnal here as well, is that though it falls apart, though the paper has fallen apart, once it dries, it holds where it is. It won't continue to disintegrate. And the paper and the metaphors of the paper are stronger than they seem. Those familial bonds are stronger than they seem. And just to show you one last image, the works are grouped according to how people asked for their family. And so ministers would read these ads from the pulpits, people would get the paper and share it quite often, and people would start to ask in similar ways. And it becomes, like the hymnal, a kind of chorus through time of longing. So repeated refrains became, let me show the next slide. Have you seen her? I last saw him in Mississippi. Have you seen them? Can you help me to find my people? Will the ministers of the South please read this from your pulpits? And those become the link that groups these ads together, as well as the dates. All of these are from the 1890s, which is considered the nadir of race relations in the US post-Reconstruction. So at our worst, people were still looking for their kin, and that ties them together or keeps them bound together like the hymnal. That's all I wanted to show, just to give a kind of context for our conversation, and I'm really looking forward to Dario's talking about his work.
Thank you, Bethany. That was wonderful. And each time I hear you talk about your work now, there's more layers to unfold within it. And Jennifer, thank you too. I mean, certainly, if anyone's blown my mind with print making, it's been you, certainly. So I'm glad I've helped you think about sounds in an interesting way too. And thank you to the Print Center for having me on the show. I'm thrilled to be part of it. It's a topic that's kind of an odd one to pair print and sound, but it's a very fertile ground, which I think both of us are going to demonstrate tonight. But what I wanted to talk about was mainly focus on the project in the show. And if I have time, I'll just talk about one other work that's relevant here. But to give everyone just a sense of what this project is, as Jennifer mentioned, it's a set of 50 prints. There are only a handful in the show, but it's a portfolio that I'll talk about in its entirety, even though I won't focus on all the prints. And we can go to the next slide. This is the portfolio box that they're encased in. And inside are all the prints. The piece, when it's displayed in its entirety, is quite significant. As I said, there are 50 prints, and they're installed in a variety of ways. It changes each time they're shown. But before I dig into some specifics of the prints, like with Bethany, the backstory is important here, and some of the technical process that I would like to just unfold a little bit, and then I'll talk more particular about the subject matter. So, as maybe some of you know or don't, but it's a fascinating, weird fertile ground in the mid 19th century when the first attempts to image sound, we can go to the next slide, Jen. The first attempts to image sound, which we all sort of take for granted today, that we know what a sound wave is, we know what it looks like, you can conjure it in your mind without being given an image. But this had to be invented. This was not an obvious thing. What sound looked like as a vibration through air molecules was a theory. It wasn't a visual, something we could look to. So these beautiful early images of these early acoustic experiments, like hitting a tuning fork and turning a soot-covered drum, a piece of paper has been covered with soot from a candle flame, and hitting different frequencies of that tuning fork, were the earliest attempts to image sound, and it changed the world. We're still living in the after moment of this development, and as maybe is not surprising, but this was a print problem. They had a problem, which was, how do you etch an image of an invisible movement permanently into another medium, and then have this other sets of problems that come with printmaking, like reproduction and settling the image. So we go to the next image. But where my work is most, I think, trying to poke at or uncover in ways that I don't think have quite been explored, is how the early attempts to record sound overlap in an interesting, fascinating way with the earliest attempts to record hidden physiological processes, like, in particular, the heartbeat, which is the physiological process I've devoted many years of my life to exploring and thinking about. And here's a beautiful little set here of the arterial pulse up in the left-hand corner. Underneath it is the first attempts to record directly from the chest wall, and then eventually to the brain itself. So things we used, like the notion of a brainwave, is also, as I mentioned, someone had to invent that concept. It wasn't an obvious thing that one knew how to image and knew what to do with that information afterwards. So it was a beautiful moment of innovation in technology, because they had this problem of how in the world do you not only locate and record, but permanently make an image of what is really a tiny, tiny vibration behind flesh and bone inside your body. But we can go to the next slide. But of course, I would argue that once the scientist Carl von Fjord figured out how to do this, he literally invented cardiology this day. Cardiology as a field of study was not yet a field of study. And think of how odd that sounds today to not have a cardiology and all the lives it's saved. But nobody could advance the field until they could do this, which was, how do you image someone's heart without cutting into their body? And he's driven by science, he's driven by humanitarian purpose, which was to diagnose. No one knew, did disease look different as a waveform? But as an artist looking at this, I like to argue that something else really beautiful happened here. Not only would I argue this is a radical new form of image making, the pulse wave and the flat line are two of the most iconic images humans have ever made, but the innovation of the material, the pushing at the sensitivity level here is stunning. Fjord's breakthrough came when he literally pulled a hair from his head, he cut it down into a small little stylus, and he hooked that little hair, his own hair, up to a tube with compressed air, and from his arterial pulse, made his own heartbeat bounce his own little hair in time, in synchronicity. And the beauty then was that hair was carving its own memory into soot from a candle flame. And so I always like to stress, the first time any human ever saw their heart beating in real time, what happened by a single hair and soot from a candle flame from 1853. It's a really stunning development. We can go to the next image. So that we'll just move on to the next one as well, Jen. Sorry. So that gets to the project itself, which is I wanted to honor the way these were made because they had essentially invented a printing process of carving images in soot and then permanently fixing it. So my project involved not only kind of relearning how to do that, plus the problem of how do you print in soot, but the why, why do this work? Why what was I after doing this? So the project entailed my attempts to locate not only the first heart ever recorded in history, which I just showed you, which I love to say, somebody's heart had to go first. And I just showed you the one that went first. And that is from there forward, every heart that's been recorded has started a beautiful lineage of, I think, human connection about what our hearts look like. And so I wanted to find the first ofs. This project is really built around first time. And what I mean by that is that, the first time the heart was recorded at all, but then of course there's all of life ahead. Every experience a human could have through the language of recording the heart was a brand new phenomenon. So my goal was, instead of searching for images of disease, which generally propelled the field, because as I said, everyone was curious, did disease look different? Which they were correct. And as I said, it started cardiology. But I looked for what I considered these outlier recordings, which were the first attempts to record the heart when someone was just living their life. Jen, we can go to the next slide. And for example, what do I mean just by living life? Well, here's the first time somebody's heart was recorded while they were smelling lavender. And this didn't have anything to do with disease directly. And I would even argue that at this time, you could put it under other categories like early sensory experience of smell or scent. But these were themselves fields that were not quite established, especially when we get to emotion. We can go to the next slide, Jen. The first time a heart was recorded while somebody was eating chocolate. It seems so mundane and banal to suggest that science would spend time and effort to record this, but what's so beautiful about it is they did it, I think, because it was the heart, because of the heart's deep, rich history, religiously, philosophically, artistically. Nobody knew, was there something else? This presumed home of the soul beating while it ate chocolate, it might be an interesting image to take. Next slide. And so the project is moving from birth to death. Each case is the first time the heart was recorded under that experience. And I'm moving, just trying to tell a portrait of somebody or many people living their lives in various ways. This one is a beautiful, strange one called threatening a little girl, 10 years old, to go to the dentist. It was an early experiment on fear, which, as I said, this is weird territory because this is emotional terrain, and people were curious what relationship the heart had physiologically to emotional states, which we all kind of intuitively know that's true, but again, nobody had seen it until they figured out this method. The next slide. And then more specifically, a few that deal with sound in relation to the show. I love these ones. They get very meta because it's not only the invention of recording sound as an image, but it's itself a test on one processing audio information. So this is someone's heart being recorded while they were holding their breath and listening to a tuning fork. And next slide, Jen. And I'll end on this one here. It's one of my personal favorites as a fan of music, and something, again, that we all intuitively know, that there's an emotional ramification to listening to music. And this was the first attempt to show that. They chose this very sad song, Love Alone, and it's described as sadness from listening to a sung melody. And here it is, something every human on this planet has probably known, but now imaged in a brand new way. which was a heart feeling melancholy due to a musical experience. And I really, these are people, they left their hearts behind. And I really, I think we'll talk more about process together, especially have some questions for Bethany with that. So I'll pause on sort of the labor and the process aspect of this. But to wrap up my opening point here, I'll go to the next slide. And I'll just throw in an earlier work that Jennifer was reminded me this theme has been recurring throughout my work. So, this is 1998, much earlier process, but I wanted to show it because of the flame process and the interest in soot and sound. But in my early attempts, I come from a DJ background, and one of my earliest attempts to sort of reimagine how one could DJ. And plus, I spent many years of my life in a honky tonk, which definitely left a mark on me. But these matches are little matches that I carved. And on the head of each match is a very thin coat of melted vinyl records, specifically from various honky tonk artists, Patsy Cline, Conway Twitty, Tammy Wynette, all songs that I had a deep relationship to as a young boy. Very, very sad songs, not unlike the image I just showed you. But when I coated each head of the match with this melted vinyl of that singer's voice, singing something quite dramatic and sad, when the match is lit, it burns, the flame burns through that thin coat of vinyl and produces quite an unusual amount of smoke in the process as it's burning the voice and burning through. And what I particularly loved about this piece was, in this body of work, was I took these back to various locations so that they could be used in real life scenarios. And when these were laid on various counters at honky tonks. And so the image I hope I can conjure in your mind here is that age-old phenomenon or scenario of, hey baby, can I light your cigarette? And unbeknownst to them for a moment, when that match was struck, hovering in the air between them were the lyrics of Patsy Cline. More than likely, they inhaled her voice, probably directed the outcome of that relationship in some significant way, I hope. And they ingested the sound internally through breath rather than through their ears. And so I have a body of work that's continually trying to push on different sensory avenues to an audible experience. And so I'm going to pause. Jen, we can pass the next slide, and I'll hand it back over to Jennifer. Maybe we'll circle back to that one later.
Great. Yeah, Jen, you can, yeah, that's good. We'll stay here for now. Thank you both. As always, my head is spinning with new ideas and connections between your projects and your careers. There's so many connections that we could talk about, and we will never get to all of them. You're both so highly sensitive to the desire for connection that's embedded in music and language, as well as the near impossibility of achieving it. You're both deeply concerned with the problem of translation. You both care a great deal about the embodiment of sound. You both show this really remarkably earnest engagement with emotion and its history and its complications. You both actually also have, as we'll see in a moment, you have an interest in the history of religion and religious music. And you both explore questions of destruction and memory and survival in your work, the ethics of memory, especially. So we could talk about all that, but I'd like to start actually by talking about the issue of performance or playback and the ways that that has manifested itself in your work, and particularly in these two projects. Like, one of the themes of this exhibition that has floated up to the surface for me anyway is this idea that print is a storage device for music or sound that can then be released from it again as an event We might say that music waits in print, hoping to be reawakened or played back. And this is obvious in the case of something like a vinyl record, where you have this engraving that you play back and release the music from inside, but maybe less so with a printed sheet of paper. But both of you are essentially interested in playing your prints, playing back your prints. Bethany, your work does this through live performance of the hymnal and other books that you've made. Dario, through a more literal form of recording playback. But you're both really interested in pulling sound back out of these prints. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So maybe we could start with you, Bethany. If you could talk a little bit about the performance of your works. And by the way, this work will be performed here for the Print Center in January. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But yeah, could you tell us a little bit about the decisions that go into shaping and performing the hymnal, and what you've learned from the performances that you've put together?
The performances come out of, thinking about the spiritual, religious kind of references underneath a lot of the work. They come out of, I grew up in Alabama in a very liberal Presbyterian church, and we used to do these 48-hour, maybe they were 72-hour Bible readings. And so you would sign up for your hour, day or night, and come and read from the text. You're always hoping you don't land on Deuteronomy. And if it's 3 a.m., you're also hoping that someone shows up at 4 to relieve you from your post. Usually there's nobody in the pew listening, and yet annually we would come back, and people still do this with the Odyssey and other, less religious but sacred texts today. The idea was still that even if no one is in the pew, even if no one is listening, the sacred text is worthy of being read back into the world. So it's also my way to grapple with democracy. Even if no one is listening, this hymnal is worthy of being sung back into the world with all its problems and all its failures. It still needs to be sung. So the first performance I did was in Miami at Locust Projects, and I did an open call. So anyone could come and sing for 30 minutes. I think it was 30 minutes. And I already know I'm a very controlling person, but I relearned it in that performance because a lot of times it sounded lovely and it was beautiful and painful, but beautiful. And then every once in a while it sounded horrible, or the singer wasn't actually familiar with the tune, or the choir that I worked with to sing this kind of polyphonic, simultaneous versions at once got a little bit confused and lost track of where they were supposed to be singing. And initially that made me really uncomfortable. And I still think those are in some ways failures, but I think that failure is actually intrinsic to the work. It's the same way that the hymnal falls apart. None of the performances are perfect, but the way that they fall apart, each a little bit differently. The way they fall apart feels like it's reflective of democracy. The way they fall apart, it shouldn't always be beautiful. Sometimes it's horrible and it should sound that way. But I also think, it's the last thing I'll say, that I also think that the performance won't be done. So I've done several of these. An open call. I selected the singers. We did a choir, polyphonic versions at Mee's Chapel, different cities. But I think the performance of America, a hymnal, even though it's happened several times, is actually not going to be finished until it's 100 different performances, different places, different cities, different singers. There has to be a kind of endurance quality and imperfection spread out over time. It has to undulate in a kind of chronology that feels more reflective. In that way, it's only then will it be complete. In the same way that the hymnal is done, but it's still falling apart. It's still up for grabs. What's going to happen to it? The performances aren't finished yet. They're each little imperfect ways. I haven't reached 100.
Do you want to play this one?
Oh, sure. So this is, I can't play this one, but this is a singing six different singers are singing versions of My Country 'Tis of Thee simultaneously. And this is a moment of crescendo, just to give you a sense of what it sounds like.
Jen, you can hit play.
Think of the cruel chain, endure no more the pain of slavery. Why should a tyrant bind a cultivated mind by reason well refined, ordained free?
Oh, it'll just keep playing. You can just more chaos. Yeah.
That's great. You know, one of the things that strikes me about these performances, or at least this one, is that the voices are in a way following the cut of the laser down into the stratigraphy of the book, right? Like, because you use an act of subtraction, or even like drilling down into the codex form of the book, in order to print the notes are always connected in a kind of vertical stratum. So you get into the sort of historic meat of the song in all of its different meanings, both through these voices and through the fire. Really wonderful. So can we, let's see, go forward to, did you want to mention this one, or should we wait till later on this?
You could wait till later.
Okay. And then one more, Jen? Right. So let's hear a little bit from Dario about performance and actually playback. So Dario, you've also arranged performances of your prints, but because your printed inscriptions are actually recordings of sound and lexical recordings of sound rather than symbolic notations, your process involves a little bit different forms of collaboration, different understanding perhaps of what playback means. Can you talk a little bit about that, about what are the challenges of pulling sound out of these old waveforms, many of which were recorded, prior to Edison, prior to the invention of sound playback?
Yes, the concept of playback, I can't stress enough how much that is part of what my interest as an artist. And it's one of those things we sort of take for granted, that it's a concept and a technology we all have access to. Bethany just displayed it right now. We're going to record this conversation and play it back later. But I wanted you to try to get the audience to try to put your head back to a moment where that was not a possibility. This is really weird technology, especially when it comes to sound. And I wanted to put these images back up because something we've lost sense with is that when it comes to each sense, vision, sound, taste, touch, etc., vision takes a hold of our imaginations for obvious reasons. We know what things look like from a long time ago because of engravings or sculptures or prints or paintings, etc. But generally, human psychology has evolved to not expect to hear things again. It's just not the way it's set up. Sound and light operate very differently. Photons we can see a star from 13 billion years ago, but we can't hear anything back from roughly 1877. there's a 13 billion year gap in sensory information, and that really pains me. I have to be honest. It really does, because think of the beautiful ways we know each other, and the past is hijacks the wrong word, but it's by necessity, it's almost all visual. But think of touch and taste and sound, other avenues to knowing each other that we just are cut off from. So what I've tried to do with this work, and I have to, we can go to the next slide. What I've tried to do with this work is build off my colleague, Patrick Feaster, who I really hope everybody will take the time to learn more about what he's done. He's blew open a brand new way to think about historical sound. And together we've been pushing on it even further, but in the most concise way. As I mentioned earlier, those early acoustic experiments were meant to visualize sound. And Edward Leon Scott, an early French scientist, was able to do it in a very successful way. These are the actual soot tracings that are held in an archive in Paris. But Patrick and a handful of others had an incredible breakthrough, which was, but if they were recorded as sound, why can't we play them back today, even if they predate the invention of playback? And it's really more precise to say that Thomas Edison, who's given credit for this, it's more precise to say that Edison's genius was he invented playback. Others had figured out how to record sound. They just never thought to play it back because it wasn't a concept. So Patrick and his colleagues, thank God Edward Leon Scott properly stored away the soot tracings of him doing an early experiment, which was him singing a French lullaby in his laboratory in 1860. This would have been 17 years before Edison invented playback. And Patrick, with high resolution imagery and building software, were able to play it back today. Well, this is in 2010, but I want to play for you this recording of a human singing 17 years before playback, who themselves did not even know that it was a concept or a possibility to hear their voice again. But today we can hear it. Let's play that now. So that is a literal ghost in the machine, a voice pulled back from soot from a candle flame. It's a really stunning achievement, and Patrick has blown open the door to pre-Edison sound recording, which was not even a category of scholarship until recently. But the thing that Patrick and I have been working on is that it actually turns out that if you look at the physiological recordings that I'm most interested in, which is the heartbeat, those actually predate the recording I just played you. And so we are on a type of mission here, which is how far back can we go? What is the physical limit? Is there one? I mean, presumably we're going to hit a wall at some point. And, going back 17 years is not going back 13 billion, but it's 17. And why not keep trying to go back further? So we can go to the next slide. But a project we've been working on, and we've been doing many others, is, can you hear a heart beating from the middle of the 19th century in soot from a candle flame? And the answer is yes, we can. And we have sort of systematically been tracking down other recordings, visual recordings, and building the software to play them back. Here's an image of what project we worked on for years of 28 different recordings, all again being the first time of various instances. And the research turned into an installation. All of these recordings were pressed to vinyl. I wrote them up with liner notes, like any kind of audiophile would probably love to read, and encased in this box. And the viewer is able to hear a select few of them. but we're working on this even to today. I have all kinds of new ideas on how to push back further in time. But to wrap up here and to build off the beautiful work, Bethany's doing, which I think is so inventive. These are little different strategies, but there's a similar desire to, I think, hold on, or to not hold on. Not even the right word is to reach back for the first time and feel around for something back in the past that nobody knew could be pulled forward. And what I love about artists, especially ones working with scientists or engineers in these esoteric worlds, is that you combine the poetic thinking with these innovations in technology, and who knows what else we're going to uncover. But I certainly I am not content that 1853 is as far back as we can go. So I'll pause there, Jennifer. Yeah.
Sorry. And you too are using soot and flame as a signal for a stratigraphic or archaeological retrieval from the past as well, just because your prints are made by printing the waveform, then depositing a layer of soot, like almost a Vesuvian layer of soot over this ruined waveform, and then digging it back up in the final print. Do either of you have questions for each other at this point?
I do, yeah. I know we have a great question ahead from you, Jennifer. I don't want to cut into it too much, but Bethany, can I ask you something?
Yes.
Okay. Because I was struck as you were speaking about what I would consider the lack of fidelity. How each of us is grappling with what counts as fidelity is a better way of saying it, for the types of data or information we're trying to pull out from the past. And I was just struck how you might think about that. Like for me and Patrick in this work, we're limited by the recordings in some way that were made in soot that were never meant to be played back. And so fidelity, it's still in alignment though with the data as it is. We're trying to meet it on its own terms. For example, when that recording was played back, the fact that our ears can pinpoint Au clair de la lune as the song being played out of it, it's not perfect fidelity, but there's enough to know this is a distinct tune sung at a different point in time. But how do you deal with that in your own work? Like, what are your standards for fidelity when you're having these performances sung back? Or the way the information decays through the handling of the book, which as I understand is something you hope for, but it would be in a sense degrading the fidelity further in some interesting way. I don't know. I just was curious your thoughts on that.
I've been thinking about, I'm working on a monument project for next year, like recarving one of the Confederate monuments that came down last year. And I was listening to a lecture that Elizabeth Alexander gave, where she talks about there is a similarity between poems and monuments. Like the scale of them is different, but they both outlive their maker, and they both help us to remember into the future. I think I'm much more comfortable. I'm less comfortable with the permanence that a monument requires, and the way that a poem lives, like you can remember it. It lives because it lives in the body, or because we share it or we write it down. And something about the life of that feels much more comfortable to me. And I think it's the same of the songs, like just because the tune is burned away, if you still remember it, if you still hum it as you turn the page, it still has a life. But I'm not sure that that's what I'm hoping for either. I think in these works, I'm hoping to act as like a translator, not as author, but as a translator. Like, let me compile 100 versions. You trust me to compile 100 versions and show them to you. But I edited. There were some that were so bad, I refused to put them in the hymnal. Like, I'm not pulling from the KKK songbook because it doesn't need to be reprinted. I need to like hint that that's part of our history. I'm not going to participate in its re-singing. And so I think my hand is present. Like, I think that's a way to answer this question, is like, it's not, there's not an officiousness to this. It is just another version. And this one is by my hand. Does that, I think that gets at that question.
Yeah, I think too that, oh, sorry, Dario.
Just to quickly wrap up, like the fact that you emphasize the inconsistencies in translations of other, like people whose skill was translating, and there's no consistency. Like the fact that you would single that out, and then the other tactics you use in your works strike me as you saying that maybe fidelity in some pure sense is just an impossibility in principle. There's no perfect interpretation or perfect playback. And I'm just drawn to that because, as you saw in what I'm doing, I'm trying to get close to the real playback as possible, because I've set up the problem in a different way, that it's hinging on, it's just static unless we can create the right enough fidelity so that it's legible, that you can hear Au clair de la lune. So I was struck by that you seem to be poking at that. I don't know if it's too strong to say you think it's in principle impossible to have perfect fidelity in historical documents, but I really liked that.
Yeah.
How different it is than what I'm trying to do.
I think too that you're both, the question of fidelity is inevitably different because, Dario, you're trying to pull something out of an indexical recording, like a physical material recording of a voice that has the same form going in as coming out. But, Bethany, you're working with symbolic notation of music, which is a form of recording, but a very different kind of recording. And, that seems like so much of your work is precisely about making that leap between symbolic notation and kind of embodied performance, or a tune or a melody and its meaning. Has a much bigger leap to make between input and output. And so the fidelity gap, it seems to me, is much wider, and you're kind of playing in that gap in an interesting way. Okay, so we are a little behind. I just wanted to mention before we move on to the next topic that both of these projects do have upcoming performances. So Bethany's hymnal will be performed in January at the Meeting House of the Religious Society of Friends at 15 Rutherford Place. It's part of the programming around the show. The exact date has not yet been set, but it's sometime in January, so everyone should keep an eye on the Print Center website for the exact date. And then again, Dario's exhibition at the Block Museum is opening on the 26th. And if you're in Chicago and you see that show, you will be able to listen to recording to what Patrick Feaster calls educed recordings from these very early pulse prints. Okay, let's see, could we go to the next slide? Thanks. So I just wanted to, since this is in fact an exhibition and a program about print, I wanted to just raise the question of print very specifically here before we go to questions from the audience. Neither of you are printmakers or consider yourselves to be printmakers per se, but print broadly defined plays this really pivotal role in your work, and particularly in the way it negotiates your relationship to sound. And I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about how you have thought about print in your practices. So Bethany, for example, normally we think of print as a medium whose purpose it is to make information legible and predictable and replicable. But you have tended to use print process, I think, in order to produce the opposite effects, contradiction or ambiguity or uncertainty. You have books about contrafacta and books about contronyms. So like in your embossed works, you use the press to print text that seems to murmur from an unstable place that can't be read or even seen. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about this. Like, how has printing and printmaking worked in your life and your career? And how do you think about it in relation to the broader themes and what you do?
I think, and this was part of my question for Dario, what print has allowed me to do. I'm not a printmaker, and I admire the fastidiousness that it requires, but it doesn't come naturally to my practice. But what it has allowed is for what the early work was doing, which was trying to make the problem in the text, to kind of make it physically manifest by doing something 100 times, that it feels like it's part of the body. And then also to try to solve that, but the solution always requires repetition and usually some sort of limitation of pain. Like I can write this 100 times and I'll stop when my hand hurts.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way to limit the abstraction of the work. I grew tired of pain as a necessary limitation or a necessary way to give value to the work. And I think what print gives is it transfers the onus onto the viewer. Like blind embossing, the Ferguson report, the DOJ report on Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown's death, onto Somerset, radiant white paper, means that it's not necessarily difficult for me to make. The labor is different, but it's really difficult to read, physically and emotionally difficult. It's literally just hard on the eyes because the light keeps bouncing back from that white paper. And so it transfers whatever problem I had with the text. It's like, this is now your problem. This is the viewer's problem, or at least it is now shared between us. But that's part of also my question for Dario is this, that pain as a kind of necessary endeavor in order to give value to the work is where I landed for quite some time. And I think not necessarily labor, but a kind of laboriousness also feels crucial to how you approach your work. But maybe it's from a different place.
Mm-hmm. Well, in our wonderful, pre-Zoom conversation, I mentioned that it's raised to a level of a motto, which is, what do I need to do to earn the respect of this material? And that often means labor, and especially, painful labor, emotionally and physically. That's not always obvious in the work, in the final version of it, but it's part of the background area that matters much to me. I think I know like you, that we're dealing with highly sensitive, personal, emotional memories of other beings, other humans who lived complex lives, and the language that you're drawn to, the stories that it's telling, and in my own way, the language of the heart. It's an abstract language of the waveform, but it's no less a written form of language. It's telling stories of, I'm fearful, or I've fallen in love, or my heart's broken, or whatever, all the various emotional states that I've been drawn to, searching for those lost hearts. I'm highly aware that I'm looking for someone's heart. And these are people right at the cusp of being remembered in this way, because this is the beginning of a new technology. All of us today are sort of used to the notion that, your Apple Watch is probably recording your heartbeat right now. But think of the handful of people who went first, as I said earlier, and left behind, 9 snippets of a pulse wave of their heart, and were never recorded again because the technology was still so cutting edge. And when I track that down, which itself is often a laborious process of finding it, because I'm asking such a specific question, like, where's the first heart that smelled lavender? It's like, where do you begin to look for that? I gotta figure it out. And then the process is set up in such a way that I have to keep earning it. I didn't really have much time to go over that process, but all those images are hand sooted. They are by hand also excavated back out, those thin lines with a little paintbrush. And it was very meditative to trace over the past actions of another's heart in a very direct way with my hand. And in every way that I can, I try to remember and honor them, especially with in a similar, interesting way to your work, Bethany. I wanted to mention that it was not a given that those people would have been, that deep personal information would have been noted about them beyond dry facts or biological facts like age, pulse rate, etc. It wasn't a given that their names would have been written down, or what anything more about them. And these were, that notion of consent in a hospital setting with experimental medicine was not a concept anybody was worried about at the time. And they tended to be peasants. They tended to be poor people who had horrible injuries, stuck in a hospital, and whose bodies were freely available to record from. And in hindsight, we can look back with some horror with that. But that's also important to me, and the labor and the way I work for it. Mm-hmm. And the work I try to do, and Jennifer has done a lot of this work too on this topic, but can we find out who they were? What were their names? Where did they live? Did they have children? Did they have grandchildren? All that is stuff that I'm actively trying to uncover based on a little snippet of 8 random beats of their heart, of a heart that's likely had given them 3 billion, just a tiny drop of in the ocean of their life, and trying to do the detective work of figuring out who they were. I see that in your work too, which I'm really moved by and respond to, that we go through all this effort so that we can flesh out these people in more detailed ways. Tell me if I'm over reading things in your work, but I like that about what you do very much. I feel in tune with it.
And you both seem to be importing all of that deep emotional and physical work in a print environment or on a printed object in ways that's very interesting, because in a sense you need the printing process to sort of record these heartbeats, to preserve and disseminate music through time. In your case, Bethany, I mean, if you want to create a community and a connection between people that are separated, you need some kind of a printing process, at least at modern scales of society. But that can also be anonymizing and abstracting. And I think there's a sort of beautiful similarity in each of your work in the way you refuse to let that be the final story of these people, is the prints that are left behind or the prints that are reproduced and sent around, but that there's always this kind of additional singularizing investment that goes on. And like in Bethany, even in your work, the smoke, in fact, individualizes these songs in a sense, even if it's not necessarily your physical labor. The fire does it for you in essence. Okay, I'm really careful. I'm really aware of the time. It's already 8:15. I would love to get some, I would love to look at the Q&A really quickly. Let me see. And see if there are things. All right. Let me just gonna ask one question that is directed at Dario, and then this might also help. You might be able to leap off from this, Dario, to talk a little bit about your relationship to print more fully as well. So, question from April Johnson. She says, Dario, is your work related to synesthesia and cymatics? I'm interested in artists working with sound in this way.
Well, it's it's interesting. It's related to those topics in the sense that I'm really curious how to recover a broader range of sensory experience that may have bled into another. Like for example, I'm given visual information that contains another sensory experience in it, which is sound. And because of the way things happened in that moment in the mid 19th century, as I said, the visual primacy of the technology meant that it had to be a visual sensory experience. But as I'm saying, I want to challenge that notion that we need to be beholden to the one or two sensory experiences we're given. And are there creative workarounds? Is there a way to dig into touch or taste through these waveforms? I don't know, but I'm trying to find out because I'm driven so I'm interested in the confusion or the bleed over of one sensory experience into another so that it becomes a pathway to the past of unlocking or uncovering information that we just presumed is not there at all, or we've lost or won't have access to. So those topics matter to me in that sense. I think in a more creative way, rather than maybe the medical version of it, or if I think I know what you mean by cymatics. I think my answer would apply to that point as well. Yeah, so that's how I'm interested in it.
Yeah, because it seems too that that switch between the visual record and all of this other sort of sonic information that you understand to be buried within it is, it's part of a flip between the senses that you see as digging into sort of histories that haven't been accessible before now, right? So this history of sound, which the visual print is a kind of gateway into that history of sound, and that history of sound is in the image.
Yeah, gateway is that's a good word. It is a gateway, and want to keep pushing on it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's my latest theory of art, is all just gateways and portals. So if any of my students are watching, they will be laughing right now. Okay, I have a question too about a question from Jen Bervin. Haven't songs and sounds been recorded as textiles and used in patterning textiles long prior to recorded sound? And that could be a question for either of you, if you know that answer.
Well, Jen's going to be a better expert on the textile question than me. But if I understand the question, and maybe Jen can respond. I don't know if she can respond real time. But the way I would answer that is that in the way sheet music or inscribed lyrics to songs from millennia ago is information of sound, documents of sound, but the key that I'm focused on is different, which is live sound, the recording of the event as it occurred originally, not sheet music that can be replayed over and over and over. That's, I think, interesting distinction maybe with Bethany and I is that I want the live recording that occurred in 700 BC rather than the information handed down. So I don't know exactly if the textiles are the equivalent to sheet music in this sense. So I just don't know, Jen. I have never come across the sense that you could play live sound from information within textiles. I don't. I feel like I would have come across that by now, but maybe I'm wrong. So please weigh in. If I hope that distinction answers you, though. It's the liveness of it, the original recording played back.
And there's also the sense that, another connection I would just make is to all of the perforated print in this exhibition, which Bethany's Bethany's hymnal is also a kind of perforated print in this sense, like a player piano or something, but that all of those ways of playing music or sound from perforation, from coded perforations, move back to IBM punch cards and computation, but then those are also all based ultimately on weaving formulas and the punch cards in the jacquard loom in the 19th century. So the textiles themselves are playbacks of those punch card recordings.
Yeah. Okay. So I wonder if that's what Jen means, but the distinction would be if something else had been recording that playback live.
Right.
That other recording is what I'm interested in.
Right.
So anyway.
There's a question for Bethany about the deconstruction aspect of turning the pages on the book. Is the book meant to be deconstructed by the act of turning the pages? And I think you briefly referred to that, but maybe you can clarify how you see, and maybe you can add something about whether you see the turning of the pages of the book as a kind of performance or playback as well in its own sense.
That first hymnal, it was an edition of 25. So some of them are in collections that I think they'll be pristine in 25 years. Like they will remain untouched and no one will engage with the discomfort of actually like turning the page. And then some of them, like my AP copy where I send it out to the museum and I say, no need to put it under a vitrine if you don't want to. If you trust your space, let people turn the page. And depending on like how big of a crowd, the space gets, we make decisions. But my hope is that there are some in 20 years that remain pristine, and there are some in 20 years that are illegible, that they just are unsingable and exist really only in memory. And like the performances, by that time, then I think the hymnal will be complete. When both of those possibilities exist, it's only then is it done.
That's great.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we need to leave a few minutes here at the end for Jen to return. Is that right, Jen? Yes.
Hello, I'm back.
Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you so much. I know we have a couple questions there that we still have in the queue that we're just not going to get to. I don't think we're out of time, but this was really, really lovely. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight with us at home. Actually, Lisa's question is really great. She just asks, how do you think about the consequences of bringing these experiences and memories forward to be held and newly interpreted by each new viewer / listener of your works? And maybe you can just each leave us with kind of a thought about how you think about that. There's a way that the kind of every viewer's engagement with these works when they encounter them or hear the performance, Bethany, or encounter these recordings or encounter even the objects that contain the latent sound in them, is a kind of playback too, maybe. And so how do you kind of think about how these historical things are re-engaged over time?
I think back to Dario's question about fidelity. I think I'm toggling between accuracy. Like, how do you tell that accurate history, American history? You've got to show, I was going to use a cuss word, you've got to show the really bad parts and the really good parts. And it's mostly, you have to show it all. And then also as the translator, like my hand is making this work, there are some songs that I just don't need to be put back into the world. I don't want to be responsible for reprinting them. I don't want to pay to have them printed, and I don't want them to be sung. And so it feels like a negotiation between the two. There is no easy answer to that. There's lots of songs in that hymnal that I hate.
Well, I'll try to be quick here. There are two points. One, I want there to be an emotional reaction. I would like everyone to still remember the magic of hearing another's heart beating in real time, whether it's your partner today or someone you never met from 150 years ago. That there's something just fundamental about that. And if we can extend back in time that core human connection, that we all had hearts and we all can understand something about each other by listening to them, that there's no reason to assume, as I said, that it has to end with the people just directly around you, that we can challenge ourselves to care and empathize much further back in time than the people immediately around us. And if anything, it's a test to increase our capabilities to empathize with those around us today. If we can prove in principle there are no time or spatial limitations to how we empathize with the past. So I'm trying to prove that in principle, that you can hear someone's heart beating from the middle of the 19th century and feel something again for them. And I have another part two of that, but I'm gonna pause. That was plenty.
You know what, Dario, I think that is such a perfect sentiment to end on, this kind of empathetic engagement with the past and that can do for us in our own moment. And so I think we will call time, and thank you so much for doing this. It was fantastic. Once again, you can see visual record through January 21st at Print Center, New York. There's also a visual record publication with an essay that Jennifer mentioned that she wrote for us called Printing with Fire, or I'm sorry, Printing with Fire is a stock. Jennifer, your essay is Listening to Print.
Yeah.
Which also has some text from Ellery Erdos, our exhibitions curator, and from the sound historian and practitioner David Tu. You can get that at the gallery or online for $15, and you can also check out the PDF for free on our website. Our next public program is a guided tour of the show with a listening session led by me on Saturday, December 10 at 2 p.m. RSVP is encouraged. Register on our website, printcenternewyork.org. More details about upcoming winter programs will be announced soon, including the performance that Jennifer mentioned of Bethany's America, a Hymnal. Get on our mailing list, check out our website, follow us on Instagram at Print Center New York for those updates. When this webinar ends, you're going to see a short survey open in your browser. Thank you for sharing feedback there. It helps us develop better programs in the future. So thank you again, Jennifer, for organizing this talk. Thank you, Bethany and Dario, for so generously sharing your work with us tonight. And thank you to my team behind the scenes, Robin Siddall running our Zoom tonight, and Emma Wong for tech support earlier in the day, making these images look as good as we could to represent these beautiful works. Have a great night, everybody, and we will see you at Print Center New York very soon.
Thank you.